Hey, for the past quarter century, I've lived with my oldest son, who was blind, autistic, cognitively impaired, and epileptic. In 2004, my wife was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer, and we've lived with the complications of that disease ever since. And on June 21st of 2019, my youngest son was diagnosed with leukemia. This is a very personal issue for me, but more importantly, it is a biblical issue. Today I want to raise two significant questions related to more than 2 decades of my observing disability in the church. And at the end, we'll open it up for any questions or observations that you have. The first is, God tells us in His book that He is sovereign over all things. All things are for His glory, and all things work together for your good, including disease and disability. Do you believe it? The second is, your church can't do everything on this issue of disability, but it can do something. Something meant for your church, while also being good for the church universal. Will you do it? Now, first, a word about language. The language around disability is in constant change. Please don't be offended or suspicious of me if I use a term that you're unfamiliar with or that you disagree with, or if I'm not using a recent iteration of it. I also don't use people-first language. That is saying someone is a person with a disability rather than a disabled person, for 2 primary reasons. The communities I'm most familiar with don't use it. That is the blind community and the autistic community. Blind adults refer to themselves as blind. They do not see it as pejorative at all, but merely as descriptive. And the same with many of the autistic adults that I have come to know. So my intention is not to offend. Please continue to use whatever preferred language you have. Let us love each other on this issue and truly confound the world. We're going to be all over the Bible. My manuscript with these references and my recommendations for pastors can be found, I think, right now at theworksofgod.com. So if you wanted to follow along, you could do so on your phone or your tablets. That's the works with an S of God.com. I'm anchoring this talk in Ephesians 2:10. For we are His workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. There's enough pastors in here that you can correct me as I exegete it here very briefly. The 4 refers back to verses 8 and 9. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not through your own doing. It is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast. We should take no credit for our salvation, nor should we even want to. Workmanship and created refers to our being created beings. Good works refer to the works we do in response to God's creative work. Verse 9 is clear that works do not save us. Beforehand refers to it being true from before the time of God's creative work in making the world. God designed and executed our being created and orchestrates His creation toward the good works He prepared for us to do. Note that God is orienting us to action. First, His creative action based on His design, and then our action in response with joy and gratitude. This idea of God's purposeful, creative, sovereign action is everywhere in His Word. John 1:3, all things were made through Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. I mean, all means all. Psalm 139:13, for you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. This includes perfect foreknowledge about what will happen to what God has formed. Psalm 139:16 tells us, your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. Note, both we, that is people, are formed, in verse 13, and our days are formed, verse 16. Like in Ephesians 2:10, these days were formed before they began. This forming, creating, knitting, and making includes hard things, or what we in our limited capacities to understand God's ways might call bad things. Isaiah 45:7 tells us, I form light and create darkness. I make well-being and create calamity. I am the Lord who does all these things. Given all this, God did not have to be specific about disability. That would clearly come under this umbrella of all things. But I am glad that He did. Exodus 4:11. And the Lord said to him, who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? God is not embarrassed. This is a simple statement of fact that He creates as He pleases, some who will live a life involving disability. So let us return to the first question. God tells us in his book that he is sovereign over all things. All things are for his glory, and all things work together for your good and my good and the church's good, including disease and disability. Do you believe it? If you believe the Bible, the answer must be yes, without equivocation. Let's go back to Ephesians 2:10. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. All the elect are included here. The church has been slow to recognize that those living with one or more disabilities have gifts meant for the good of his church. Typically, people with disabilities in the church are thought of as recipients of good works from others. Yet I have met blind lawyers, blind directors of college programs, blind leaders. I know a deaf woman who runs a significant nonprofit. Companies like Ford and Microsoft, represented here, are now recruiting people with certain types of autism because they see that neurological difference as positive in terms of work outcome. If the world can see these gifts, why don't we? We know that God is not limited by anything, and in giving gifts to people, he also gives the Holy Spirit to help fully live out those gifts. My pastor, Jason, frequently uses the analogy of ditches in his sermons, pointing out that staying far away from one side is not the same as traveling down the road. Go too far in the other direction, you just end up in the other ditch. That's certainly true for disability. The ditch we avoid more easily is the murderous, dignity-robbing, God-denying ditch of killing our disabled babies before they are born, killing our disabled elderly when they are considered no longer useful. Evangelical Christians have mostly avoided this ditch. Mostly. The other ditch no less robs the dignity of God's human creation with disabilities. This ditch sees people with disabilities as recipients of service, inherently other, probably sad about their disability, and always desiring to be normal. They are then not allowed to express the gifts that Jesus himself has given them in Ephesians 2:10 because of how we perceive them. Now let's be careful here. When my son was born, I was very sad, which turned into anger and then into deep bitterness. I wanted him to have a better life than I assumed he could have. He actually has a pretty good life. But I didn't believe that at the time. I needed the time and experience and friends to process it, to tell me the truth, pray for me and with me. Please be patient with families experiencing disability. What I'm referring to in this ditch is an overarching narrative that reduces the full life of a person down to a specific set of physical, sensory, or cognitive abilities. Frankly, a significant problem for many people with disabilities is not their disability, but in how they're treated in the world, and our churches too often reflect this worldly thinking. Of course, disability is real. Not being able to walk, talk, see, or process rational thoughts makes many things difficult and some things impossible. But the persistent drumbeat of being considered worthless, if not whole, of being entirely dependent on others rather than in a reciprocal relationship, of only having value come from receiving the service of others, that's being treated more like a pet than a person. And God creates people, not chattel, even if the social shackles come in velvet gloves. Too often we deny the murderous intentions of one ditch while sliding headlong into the other with low expectations. But let me make a different argument from the one place that truly has authority, which is God's word. God has proclaimed how he acts and through whom he acts. In 1 Corinthians 1:26-29, for consider your calling, brothers. Not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God. 4 times, God refers back to worldly standards, making it very clear that they are not his standards. When God refers to those who are weak according to worldly standards, we should consider the opposite is actually true. Through God, the weak or foolish in the world have greater abilities than worldly people living under worldly standards. Further, Romans 8:8 tells us that worldly people cannot please God, no matter their abilities. He tells us in 1 John 4:4, little children, You are from God and have overcome them, for he who is in you is greater than he who is in the world. That person with a disability filled with the Holy Spirit and having gifts given by Jesus is infinitely more capable of serving the church than someone with great intellect, financial resources, or fame who is not of God. 3 times in 1 Corinthians 1, God states who he chooses to act for the sake of his name. Foolish in the world to shame the wise, meaning God is more intelligent than the wise of this world. Weak in the world to shame the strong, meaning God has greater strength than anyone. What is low and despised in the world to bring to nothing things that are, meaning God exists at greater heights and glory than anything in the world. Together we see a picture of God's intentionality in using what the world considers worthless to do infinitely valuable things for the sake of the name of God. Pastor John helpfully expressed it this way: God regularly glorifies himself by setting aside human power to magnify his own, by setting aside human wisdom to magnify his own, by setting aside human honor to magnify his own. Think about that. Even the most vulnerable in the world are used by God to magnify his name. And the most vulnerable today are those with severe cognitive disabilities. But consider how God speaks of the most vulnerable in the Old Testament. Psalm 8:2, out of the mouth of babies and infants, you have established strength because of your foes, to still the enemy and the avenger. God uses the mouths of those who cannot speak intelligible words to establish strength. I asked Pastor John if he thought Psalm 8:2 could be applied to adults like my son with severe cognitive disabilities. He agreed that this is more about ability than about age. Thus, God has told us again that he uses those in the world considers weak and stupid and worthless and expendable and expensive to magnify his name. Are we making our churches welcoming and accessible without any thought of preparing God's creations with disabilities for war? Psalm 8:2 is clear. God uses the most vulnerable to establish strength that stills the enemy. The world can't see it, but Satan has experienced it. Might there be a reason why Satan is so eager to destroy children with cognitive disabilities before they are born, or those living with dementia? Because they put him to flight. Have we been putting God's Marines on the sidelines? Or this from Dr. Benjamin Mast about people experiencing Alzheimer's. Those with dementia need not speak. Not even the disease's ravages can separate us from God's radical grace and love. We don't really know what turning to him looks like in deep dementia, but we can know that God doesn't require that we have the right words. I know a few of the men in here who are pastors. You studied hard, and you should work hard to get the right words. Absolutely. But at the end of the day, it's still God that's going to animate them. Be strengthened by that. Be strengthened by that. Compared to God, we're all weak, but God recognizes we create categories of greater and lesser, and having an evident worldly weakness is held up by God is no weakness at all. Consider 1 Corinthians 12:21 and 22. The eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, nor again the head to the feet, I have no need of you. On the contrary, the parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. John Piper helpfully states it this way. That's a careful way of talking. Paul says they seem to be weaker. He leaves open whether they are or not. They may not be, but they seem to be to one side or the other. And he says that if they seem to you to be weaker, they are nevertheless necessary. Not optional, but necessary. Not merely helpful, but necessary. Not maybe a needful part of the body, but necessarily a needful part of the body. My oldest son is weak in the world in almost every way, intellectually, physically, how he engages the world. When measures against worldly standards, he fails, frequently not even measuring on the scale. Yet, he is a human creation, one of God's intimate knitting of Psalm 139:13, the all things of John 1:3, and even the warrior cast of Psalm 8:2. When the Apostle Paul is talking about in the world or according to worldly standards or seem to be weaker, he is calling out that we cannot see all that God sees and does for his glory. Will you believe God's word? Will you embrace God's design of the weaker member in the world as the necessary one to the health of your church? Which leads to my second question. Your church can't do everything on this issue of disability, but it can do something. Something meant for your church while also being good for the church universal. And will you do it? I can't tell you what is best or right for your church in the specifics. God has given you your church. But I can invite any church to do these 6 things. And I'm speaking specifically to pastors and elders, but everyone can participate in this. First, pray. Pray for yourself. Pray that your perspective about disability is probably driven by our culture rather than by God. I do not say that to condemn you. I was that way before my son was born. Ask God to help you see with spiritual eyes those God has given you who live an atypical life. Ask him to help you understand his word. Pray for your people. Even if your perspective about disability is biblical, your people live in this culture which hates people with disabilities. Pray for them to see rightly the inherent dignity and worth God has given all God's human creation. Pray for wisdom. What might God be pleased to do through your church? Ask for his wisdom, which he has promised to give you. I'll pause here, make a plug for the Johnny and Friends booth. This portion is there. I summarized it, and Mary has kindly provided it, so you can get that there. I see you furiously taking notes, and I appreciate that. And finally, encourage your people to pray. In fact, deputize your people to pray. For example, we had a year-long season of prayer at Bethlehem, initiated and led by someone who did not have a disability, nor did he have a disabled family member. He was just concerned, and he gathered us together. And out of that season of prayer, our elders committed to investing in the disability ministry in a more significant way. Because we went hard after God, and God provided. He provided wisdom. He provided help. It didn't happen right away. We spent a year meeting regularly. The second is know your people. Just as we seek intimacy with God through prayer, seek to know your people for who they are and in all their giftings and needs. When that family comes with the little boy with autism, do you know that his name is Jeff, or is he just a little boy with autism? Or the little girl who lives with Down syndrome, is she the Down syndrome girl, or is her name Judy? Who's God already given you? This is not about creating programs, though you might do that. Small churches really have an advantage here, you small church leaders and pastors. The larger churches and mega churches can do this as well. Basically, do your elders know their people for whom they will give an account? Again, let me be clear. This is not about fixing a family or rescuing a family, although it might include elements of that, especially in the early days. This is about releasing the gifts Jesus himself gave them for the good of your church and for the fame of God's name. Know your people, their names, their circumstances, their needs, and their giftings. And please, know the entire family. Let the siblings be their own people. We families tend to live in a fishbowl, which can make church hard for siblings. They'll be known, but frequently as the brother or sister of the disabled family member. In fact, everything can be harder for siblings. Less parental attention, fewer financial resources, heightened expectations about how they should or shouldn't behave or feel. But God created them uniquely too, with unique gifts. Think about them. A third, should be obvious, preach. When you come to the disability passages, preach on the disability passages. But preach what's there, not a culturally appropriate or culturally assumed there. Attack the low expectations and misunderstandings in your people by highlighting what God is actually doing. For example, when I was a child, I was taught how nice God is to heal people, like Naaman of his leprosy or the paralytic of Mark 2. And those lessons stuck with me into my adulthood. But 2 Kings 5 is not about God being nice to a leper, but about a violent, foreign, pagan enemy of the people of God making a public proclamation that there is no God in all the world but the God of Israel. And Mark 2 is not about Jesus being nice, but about Jesus proclaiming his authority to forgive sin to a disbelieving group of Jewish leaders. Even little children can be invited into the sovereignty of God, and should be. And please, avoid disability porn. Now that sounds ugly, doesn't it? I mean it to sound ugly. Here's what I mean. Like pornography, disability porn objectifies a person, making them a tool for your use or your sermon illustrations, making them remarkable not because they have done something remarkable, but because they are disabled. Have you seen a commercial where the young people with Down syndrome are running a race and one falls down? All of them gather around him and together they cross the finish line. It's very heartwarming and it's under the banner of true victory, I think. But it's a myth. There was a real race, Special Olympics race. It was some decades ago now, and a runner did fall down. And most of the young people kept running because it was a race, and they were competitive. They had Down syndrome, but they were running a race. A couple of the young people did stop and help the young person up, and they did cross the finish line together, arm in arm. But it created this myth that people with Down syndrome don't really care about competing. All they care about is loving each other. No. They're real people. Yes, with real gifts, but also real sinful tendencies and unique experiences. They're not innocent waifs we can fawn over in our superiority. My son with cancer is told sometimes, "You're so brave." He thinks people calling him brave is stupid. What's he supposed to do? This is what's keeping him alive. If you avoid disability porn, you'll also avoid satanic sentimentality around disability. Satan would desperately like you to be sentimental and kind, doing nice things and neglecting the greater thing. Just asking the question, is the young man who became disabled in an accident a project of the church or a human being in search of his place in the world and his new reality? Do you love him or the idea of rescuing him? And do you love him enough to know that it might be years before you come to the conclusion, what is this about? Or you might never know. But do you love him? Are you willing to walk with him? Are you willing to pursue those individuals and families living an atypical life because of disability in love where their greatest need is? Satan would love to trap us into a single response where we're just providing service. Oh, we know what you need. You need a buddy. That's what you need. Maybe. That's legitimate. We do that at my church. My son goes and there's lots of volunteers with him. But maybe there's something else. Maybe something different. Are we asking the questions? Or are we reinforcing a hierarchy of greater than and less than between people of differing physical, cognitive, and emotional abilities? Basically, for you that are pastors here, pastors and teaching elders, when you preach on the disability passages, do they hear the simpering sentimentality of Satan, or do they hear the Lion of Judah roaring about the majesty of God in all circumstances? That's what we want. The Lion of Judah, the Lamb who was slain. Well, the fourth is, do something. You've prayed, you're growing in your knowledge of your people and their needs and giftings. You've prepared your people to think differently as you preach a God-honoring, countercultural view of God's sovereignty over all things. Now do something based on real needs and real opportunities. It includes simple things. Is your building accessible? Is your signage clear? People know where the accessible bathrooms are. People will come and go from your churches. They'll go from your churches if they don't know you have an accessible bathroom. That's silly. They should come to your church. We have an accessible bathroom. So those are easy things. Some things are harder. Are your greeters fearless in welcoming all? Make mistakes out of love. Just know that you're going to say something wrong. Know that you're going to do something wrong. But do it. Don't plan out of fear. And please, call men into this engagement. It's so nice to see men here. It's a pastor's conference, I know, it's lots of men here. But I've done a lot of these, and usually there's like 3 of us. And there's a reason for that. We have made it an issue for women. So call your men into engaging this issue. Not just men who are experiencing disability in themselves or their families. This is not just an issue for women. This is a very masculine issue. And please, don't have the moms of the disabled kids do everything. Yes, they have more knowledge, more experience, greater empathy, probably are best qualified. But they also live in a world that hates their children and where they carry unusual burdens. Their gifts may perfectly align. And I just said you should use people's gifts, right? And now I'm saying, don't use their gifts. Well, because I want you to know them. Is this the right time to have them engage in your church? Or might it be that they would also benefit by worship in song and the word with their people rather than running a ministry? Might it be that the 24/7 demands of working with their child needs a little relief on a Sunday morning? They might even volunteer to do it. This might be where the family says, maybe we should expand the number of people that are involved and not just have you do it. Just please, I have seen many churches with wonderful disability ministries, and it's the moms, and I want more. I just want more. I want more. And trust that God will provide for you in unusual ways. An old saint once came up to me, this is more than 20 years ago, and said, I love those idiot children. I love those mongoloid children. He was referring to children with Down syndrome. Those terms have been offensive for decades. And I was in a season where to love me was to use the right language. The Holy Spirit impressed upon me, what do you want? What do you really want? It's not an audible voice. It's just that sort of, I'm impressing upon you now. You are being confronted with this language. But what do you want? Because here was her full statement. I love Polly. I pray for him every day. I pray for you and Diane every day. And that tsunami of love that poured out of her over me made my answer to the Holy Spirit really easy. I want that. She can say whatever she wants. She can use whatever words she wants. Just let me have that love, that regard, that persistence in prayer, that going before the Father for me. Give me that. I don't care what language she uses. God intruded in a really offensive way to wake me up. Do you trust that the Holy Spirit might do that for you too? I mean, you really might step in it. And that might be God's way of saying, okay, you stepped in it. Now, do you trust me to do the greater thing? Please recognize that compassion fatigue is real. Disability is often over a lifetime. Not always, but often over a lifetime. So families like mine can experience actually long seasons of relative normalcy. You know, we're showing up, and yeah, they got the disabled kid and but they're showing up and everything seems okay. And then something happens and we're struggling again. For me, it was when my oldest son turned 13, and it was just impressed upon me all that we were missing as he entered adolescence. It was terrible. It was a terrible time. I was prepared for 16 and 18 to be hard, and the Lord was gracious in helping me. Actually, he was gracious in helping me through Bob Horning. And then my youngest son got cancer, and everything came crashing down around me. So you'll get tired of our issues, because they just keep going. They don't stop. They just keep going. I can assure you, I get tired of my issues. But ask God to help you by calling others into the lives of your families experiencing disability. Let this be a community event. Okay, number 5. Be careful before taking sides on disability issues. Say, what? Where's that coming from? I'm not saying not to take sides. I'm just saying be careful. You know, in 2 Timothy 2, we're encouraged to have nothing to do with foolish, ignorant controversies. Now I know that's in a different context, but there's plenty of potential controversy between families experiencing disability. I'll give you a couple of examples. Nutrition. So one family experiences a benefit in their child and their child's behaviors and starts to evangelize it for all children with diagnosis like their child. I have seen it turn into bullying. And then you just kind of have to step in gently and say, you know, God places children in families for a reason, and that child is not in your family. And, you know, our physical chemistry and everything else, okay, the nutrition worked for you, doesn't mean it's going to work for everybody. So you don't want to be caught on taking sides on stuff like that, because it can really hurt families. Or autism. One family seeks every measure possible to address their child's behaviors related to his autism, and you have an adult on the spectrum who embraces his autism as another characteristic like hair color. Okay? You don't want to be caught. You want to affirm as much as you can, because there are behaviors that are really hard with autism that I'm glad that some of his behaviors, not very many actually, was it, Hannah? No. But I've also met adults with autism who are just, yeah, I'm autistic, that's a big deal. Not a big deal. Or an older member does everything possible to hide or ameliorate his deteriorating hearing, while a deaf member expresses great pride in her deaf community and culture. What does love informed by the wisdom of the Holy Spirit lead you to do in your churches? And how will you lead people to be gracious in all circumstances? Finally, number 6, expect blessing to come. Expect it. Anticipate it. It will look different than you predict. I can almost guarantee that. I mean, sometimes we're good at predicting, but it's probably not going to look like what you anticipate at all. And it might take a long time. You might be really tired and frustrated and even feel like you're being beat up a bit. But it will come. And the primary thing is you will experience more of God. So again, I can't tell you what is best or right for your church in the specifics, but I can ask. Will you respond in faith when someone living this life comes to your church? Will you pray? Will you act? Will you live expectantly that God will help you recognize and use the gifts he is giving you and all your people at every stage of life? God will help you on this issue and every other issue. And the first question is, do you believe it? And then the second is, will you do it? I think we have a few minutes, and I would be more than happy to take questions. I will repeat the question so everyone can hear it. Or if you want to make an observation about what you've done in your church, that would be fine as well. Jeff. Jeff is very kind. He's a friend of mine. He's praying for me. I know that. He's kind of a radical prayer warrior. My presentations, actually Mary's presentation is available at the Works of God. We've got a little resource, right, so you can go and find them there. Desiring God did a disability conference 8 years ago now? 8 years ago. And that includes sermon by Pastor John, presentation by Nancy Guthrie. I can't remember all who was speaking, except you must, I insist, that you go and you type in at Desiring God, Krista Horning, and you listen to her 10-minute testimony. It's just 10 minutes. And then tell me what you think. So that's available at Desiring God. I've written some at Desiring God, but my speaking is mostly at the Works of God. Remind me, I'll do that at the end. Yeah, great. Question? Yes, sir. Yeah. Right, right. Yeah, again, the stories I've heard, the question was about how do we help congregations be more comfortable when our children have behaviors that are, frankly, unfortunate in social circumstances. Because my son is certainly there. Small churches have a huge advantage here because you just know, we got 100 people here, one of them has autism or one of them has a behavioral disorder. Pastor John was basically fearless about talking about important things. And so he was laying the groundwork. One of his statements was, Christian hedonists rush to suffering. I mean, we engage it. We don't run away from it. And so one of the spillovers of that is, oh, that family has a child who's behaving unfortunately here. I wonder if that's related to a disability, and maybe I should get to know that family and find out who they are, what they're up to, how I can be of service. because I would love to be of service. I love children. I love, whatever it happens to be. So it is that call from the pastor of, as Christian hedonists, we aren't afraid of anything, ever, because God is for us. Jesus himself came and died and rose again and has said he would send the helper. So we are going to behave like that. And when God has made one who is different, I will speak to that. I will speak to that. Now, we have the advantage at Bethlehem of, if you've ever been downtown, there's the glass, and we just sit behind the glass. It's actually pretty comfortable for us. When we go to the North Campus, they've got a kids' room. We go there. But at the North Campus, they also have a young man who occasionally has outbursts, who goes into the service. And he's just been doing it so long that everybody knows that. And the weird part about it is, this is years and years ago. We had Polly in the service with us, and Polly just went full autism, which is shorthand at our house for just the flapping and the vocalizing and everything. And he was still little, so we were in the service, and we had to go. He was disrupting everything. Another family saw that we were there. They said, we want to go to a church like that, where a family like that is there. And so I've come to the conclusion that the Holy Spirit got inside my boy's head and said, okay, now, for the sake of that family that doesn't know if their circumstance is going to fit here or not, whether they're going to be loved or not. So sometimes we're really embarrassed by our children's behaviors, and they can't control it, but we're just embarrassed because, it's church, right? So the proud proclamation of God's sovereignty over all things, we will not back away from that. And then what does that look like? I don't know what it looks like specifically, but we're going to do it. We're just simply going to do it because that child is a gift. End of story. Oh, they're a gift because they're so sweet. They aren't sweet. Right? Created by their maker for our good. So, we're unashamed. We figure it out. Oh, I'll go here. Well, the unhappy story is that I was not a Christian. I was a member at Bethlehem Baptist Church, sitting under Pastor John's teaching for a decade, and I was not a Christian. I thought I was. The Lord used my son to expose my heart. I did not believe that someone who had behaved as well as I had deserved this. So I took my family out of the church. There was one family that pursued us. They are remarkable because I couldn't dissuade them from pursuing us, and I really tried hard. And what they did was, it's pretty radical, they had us over for dinner fairly regularly. And they treated my son, who, he was born without eyes. He looks different. And every once in a while we'd have to have surgery on something. And so, your face gets all bruised. You look terrible. And they would play with him like he was a boy, not like he was a thing. So I'm observing this amongst their children who are between the ages of 9 and 16. I'm observing them play with this boy and find ways to play with him. And they really liked him. And I thought they were freaks. The wife of this couple would also do drive-bys. That's what we started calling them. We live on two opposite sides of St. Paul, which on a heavy traffic day can be 45 minutes to an hour. And she would call and say, well, I'm just going to drive by and drop something off, which was a total lie. The bread would still be warm. The bread would still be warm. It had come out of her oven. She had gotten in her car and driven. And here's the radical thing that she did. She'd say, hey, I was just thinking about you. We love you guys. See ya. She wasn't preaching. She was consuming us with her love, which was coming from the Father, because all of us are finite. We all get worn out. When you got a guy like me sitting, believe what you want, Carl. I know that God is cruel. I know that God is capricious. And I would point to my son. And that man was unafraid. He was simply unafraid. In fact, after one of the most egregious things I said to him, he looked me in the eye. He said, John, there's nothing you can do or say that will make me stop loving you. And then God, in his mercy, crushed me in a hospital in Indianapolis, of all places, and I became alive. So I went back to church, and that couple helped the transition with that church. They were in there, and okay, he's about 18 months old, but he's not walking yet, and how are we going to make this thing work? Because the important thing was not Paulie at that point, it was me. How do we get me to church? How do we get me into worship? How do we get me with other men who love Jesus? That was the point. And if they had to do something different in the nursery to get me to church, they were going to do it. And they were going to do it, make mistakes. They made tons of mistakes. I would get so angry. But they just kept coming. I couldn't stop them. And so they're heroes to me. So yeah, do goofy, that sounds dumb, right? Bread and inviting somebody, this is the best one. Showed up, are you familiar with Aveda? It's soap and shampoo and stuff like that. So it's a modest family. They don't have a lot of financial resources. And she shows up one day with Aveda products for my wife. And said, just thinking about you, love you, bye. It's like, these people are weird. Why would you bring soap? And to my shame, it was probably years later that I realized this woman looked at my wife and recognized she's feminine, she's lovely. Maybe she would like to have hair that smells nice. Because her husband isn't thinking about that right now. I think, yeah, you can do a lot with shampoo and bread. God changed me. And talk about seasons, then they went into a rough season. They're not at Bethlehem, they're at a church where their son-in-law preaches, which makes perfect sense because they love their daughter and love their son-in-law. I haven't even seen them for quite some time. So there are seasons when people are going to be more engaged and less engaged. And this season, we've got other people that are more engaged with us because of my son's cancer. So it's really good to call in, everyone. One more story. I don't even know what time it is. But I remember when my wife had cancer, we had 3 women, actually 2 women, and the wife of this couple I just described, who made sure that we got meals 3 times a week for 9 months. And they coordinated everything. There was no having to answer the phone 16 times. No, we don't have allergies. No, none of that. And they mixed up the food too, so we didn't get lasagna 18 times in a row. We're really good at lasagna here in the north. But, I get tired of it. 9 months, 3 times a week. And I remember a young couple showing up. They had just gotten married. I didn't know that for a fact, but they had that young couple married thing, what I'm talking about? And it always came at the same time. They were well trained. They would drop the meal off and they would leave unless we invited them in. It was awesome. And I watched that young couple pull up and get out, and I said, that's what courage looks like. That's what courage looks like. What was their conversation coming over? Okay, we got this meal. What are we doing? Well, mom's got cancer. It's stage 4 cancer. It's pretty bad. Oh, wow. Yeah, and their oldest son has all these disabilities. Whoa, man, that's rough. Yeah, and their youngest is 1 year old. Wow. Okay. Car pulls up. They got, let's do it. That's courage. That's courage. Walking into a burning building, an emotionally burning building. As a young couple that hadn't experienced a lot of sadness yet, because you can just tell, that's courage. That's how you want to train your people. Train your people ahead of time. You're going to do things that are going to be really uncomfortable, and you might bless the one who's receiving it in a way that you did not intend, because the Lord is going to go ahead of you. Do you believe that? Do you believe that God will go ahead of you? Okay, anything else? I think we have to wrap up. Are we at time? Okay, I love prayer. My youngest son has leukemia. He is in the midst of his treatments. Last week was a bad week. He was sick a good portion of it. He and I were at the emergency room on Friday because he was having fevers. And the Lord has sustained him. He was doing his Bible reading this morning as I was getting ready to go. He's generally pretty cheerful, even in the midst of all of this. Not a 16-year-old boy. I don't really like having a 16-year-old boy, my 16-year-old boy, facing. His sister is here. She's been an incredible help. She moved back in with us after his diagnosis. So he's got a road ahead of him yet, but he's doing well. We're going after the cancer-creating cells. I don't even understand physiology at all, but that's what we're going after right now. And he'll be getting weekly or biweekly treatment probably through April, and then he'll go to monthly treatment for the next 3 years after that. His name is Johnny.